Okay, you're listening to Isles FM on 103. This is Innes Morrison. And my featured artist tonight is Julian Cope, up here at the moment, seemingly filming stone circles and stuff like that.
If you just come and see what's going on in Britain, in this big island, it's kind of empowering to realize that it's on your doorstep. That we don't have to drive across America to achieve our inner self. I came out of punk, and punk was taught to sort of diss everything to do with hippies, and Stonehenge was to do with hippies. So I was one of those who came to mock and remain to pray. You know, I went to Stonehenge this one day with my mother-in-law, and she said, "Darling, when was this done?" And I told her the date. I said it was about 2,000 years before Christ. Wow, that's just amazing. It's physically so impressive. And I thought, wow, and I suddenly saw it through her eyes. And I was suddenly impressed by it. And we came to Avebury and flipped out that there was this stuff, these kind of, you know, pre-roofed temples lying around on the landscape of Britain. And so my mind started thinking, wow, we've really been brought up to diss where we are. If you spend your whole life thinking, oh, I can't wait to get away to Ibiza, then you're not going to look close by.
The Antiquarians, however, took an interest in Avebury during the 17th century and recorded much of the site before its destruction. Archaeological investigation followed in the 20th century and led primarily by Alexander Keeler, who oversaw a project of reconstructing much of the ancient monument. In the 1930s, archaeologist Alexander Keeler was carrying out excavations at Avebury when under one stone, which is number 9 in the southwest quadrant of the henge, was found to contain the skeleton of a man. It was believed that he was an itinerant barber, surgeon or tailor who had suffered various injuries when the stone had fallen and trapped him. This skeleton was found the remains of a leather purse containing a pair of scissors, a probe and some coins. Since the tools found alongside his bones suggested he was a barber surgeon, the murderous megalith has become known as the Barber Stone and today stands proud and erect upon its original site.
quoit. And tune quoit is a dolmen, the smallest dolmen, but the most beautiful of all. A dolmen is a kind of a megalithic or great stone box with a large capstone on top. Dates back about 4,500 to 5,000 years. And it's a phenomenon that you find all over Cornwall, you find all over West Wales, parts of South Wales, and a lot in Ireland. But elsewhere, you don't really see them. You see some in Brittany, but this is where you find the best ones. People have to think of tune quoit as being the megalithic mushroom, and I think really it's the one that looks most like it. It's so much smaller than the others. It's really hard. You can squeeze in here, but even that's difficult. First thing that this says to me is free time. You don't spend any time building this unless you've got free time. This is a culture which has grappled and finally grasped some kind of control away from the earth, and is now standing proud in itself and saying, hey, we exist as well. I would imagine that tune quoit was used for all kinds of different rituals. Most of those are lost to us. I think that you can spend your life conjecturing. It's very easy to get new age about things like this. But the most important thing is the fact that this thing still exists. There are so few of them, and we're here just to celebrate the fact that it's still here. I'm walking into the middle of Boscawen Stone Circle. I think it's the greatest stone circle on the Land's End Peninsula. And I'm walking right up to the centre. What makes it the greatest is its position almost at the Land's End, and the fact that it has this huge monolith leaning at the very centre. The stone circle was entirely enclosed by gorse until last summer solstice, where it was all cleared back, because so many people visit here on the summer solstice. But this is probably the most living site in the whole of Land's End, maybe one of the most living sites in the whole of Britain. I don't think any casual tourists come here. I just don't think they find it. It's just off the A30, but there's no sign. And as one crusty once said to me, people don't go anywhere nowadays unless there's a sign. Fugu's an underground chamber which you find in Cornwall, which people who haven't travelled tend to confuse with souterrains, which are other underground chambers which you find in Ireland, in Brittany, and Scotland. But fugus have a seemingly different function. So this is Ian Cook, who's a fugu obsessive, and has written a fantastic book called Mother and Son. S-U-N. Yeah. Are you suggesting this was some kind of religious shrine to the fruits of the earth?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair remark. I would certainly suggest that, yes. I think all the evidence goes... Yes, I do. I mean, makes far more sense than ideas of refuge and storing bits of meat and whatever.
I think what you've got at Callanish is a love of ritual taken to an obsessive level. The most impressive thing is that you've got such a complete monument. From 1857 to the present day, that's when we see the stones as they are. For thousands of years before that, until about here, the stones were entirely covered in peat, which preserved the stones because nobody thought that it was a very important monument. All this stuff which would have been destroyed in their most fundamental Christian times had a chance to live. Then, suddenly antiquarianism in the 1800s became very cool and very hip. And so the Lord, the Laird, said, aha, we will now reveal the stones. And then, here was revealed one of the most fantastic monuments in the whole of the British Isles. To see this in its complete state, it's just wonderful. Here in Callanish, at last, with two dear friends that I've been talking about all the way, Margaret and Ron Curtis. They've become completely obsessed, and everything that they've discovered is eye-opening and fantastic.
Having come to Callanish, it's like an empty crossword or something, or an undone jigsaw. You just get in and do it. Ron and I met up at a very early stage, and he taught me how to do the surveying and horizon profiles. It's a very scientific thing, checking the astronomy. Once you put the lunar stuff in, it all fell into place. Say these sites are lunar observatories, if you will. They were also a centre of focus for the community. These people had a lot more knowledge than we have nowadays about the natural movements of the sun and the moon. The very layout of this main site is like a calculator or an almanac. You can go back and read what's happening. It would work today. You only need to be here a couple of months and you can tell exactly how far you are through the 18-and-a-half-year cycle. At Callanish here, it's gone beyond sort of practical into a much more ceremonial thing. Each site is like a stage set. You view through it and the gaps between the stones form a frame. Probably replicating a ceremonial that took place 5,000 years ago, once a month, for a few months every 18 and a half years. These times when the moon was on its very low track. And the audience, or congregation, whatever you want to call them, weren't in the circle, they were down the far end of the avenue. So let's go and see what it was they were looking at. This funny spacing of stones is real. There aren't any stones missing here. The positioning of these and spacing is critical to keeping tabs on what the moon is up to and what it's going to do tomorrow night. Because if you've got this drama, you don't want it to go wrong. Whoever's in charge, a single person or a committee, has got to know what's going to happen tomorrow night. A Callanish here, it's primarily to do with the moon, but the moon related to those Mother Earth hills. Kayak no Montag. In Gaelic it's the old woman of the moors, but in English people refer to her as Sleeping Beauty. If they weren't there, Callanish stones wouldn't be here.
The ancients were very theatrical. To a certain extent, they became what I would term even like the first glam rockers. Recently, it's been discovered that the ancients were wearing makeup, that the women were wearing glamorous outfits, that the guys were swanning around in good gear. You know, this idea that they were barbarians is fairly kind of misleading. They were taking control of their lives, and as they were taking control of their lives, they were feeling better about themselves. You feel better about yourself, your sense of your physical makes you stand more upright, and that's what you become.
The Isle of Wight is the place where the spine of Albion, the long-distance lay running from here to northern Scotland, discovered by Guy Ragland Phillips with its two serpentine currents called Belinus and Ellen, discovered and researched by Gary Biltcliffe and Caroline Hoare, enters the British Isles from the south. There seem to have been many instances of time anomalies along its length, as well as other strange phenomena. According to local author Gay Baldwin, the Isle of Wight is the world's most haunted island. Its reputation stems from the great number of unexplained phenomena that have taken place all over the island, observed by both locals and visitors alike. People have witnessed phantom Roman soldiers marching across Brading Down and marauding Vikings carrying flaming torches. Some of the unique incidences experienced by tourists and locals include the appearance of ghost buildings. When a couple attempted to revisit a particular pub where they had enjoyed a drink on a previous evening, they found it had vanished with no record of it ever having existed, and people have seen the ghostly appearance of villages and streets in areas of open countryside. There is no doubt that this island is a unique and mystical place. Continuing along the Tinner's Way, so named as the island was a centre for trading Cornish tin and Mendip lead, eventually we came to Puck's Pool, a fish pond for the Abbey, but it preceded it. It has a reputation for strange phenomena, including balls of light. The Puck name, associated with the mischievous spirit mentioned in Shakespeare, crops up all over the island and even occurs in Puckaster Cove to the south, which has a legend about Jesus landing there. This could be so, as he is said to have come with his great-uncle Joseph of Arimathea, who was said to be a tin trader. There are fault lines beneath the pool, which could cause earthlights, which often seem to respond to human emotion. On Brading Down, there are many reports of encounters with Romans, Vikings, etc., and possible time slips. We went from here to Swanmore Church, south of Ryde, where the mail current comes through. It has decorative brickwork inside, which may represent the alchemical elements. There is a statue of St. Michael overcoming Satan and one of St. George and the Dragon. Gary mentioned that these possibly represent Gemini and the stars Castor and Pollux. On Saturday, we began on Brading Down, on the Serpent Ridge crossing the island, the shape of which is similar to the moon's path in the sky. It also holds Bembridge Fort and the obelisk. Brading Down is the highest hill on the island. Ghostly Roman soldiers, druids, Vikings, etc. have been seen here, and strange beasts. The veil seems thin on the Isle of Wight. These could be recordings on rocks. There was one case of a doctor and his wife who saw what seemed to be an Iron Age man on horseback who rode straight through their car.
behind me are a series of stones that make up the circle at Avebury in Wiltshire. It's an enormous circle of standing stones measuring 300 metres in diameter, surrounded by a ditch that would originally have been 60 feet deep and a bank 60 feet high that go all round it. It's the most massive monument. It's so big that there's a modern village complete with pub, church and school inside it. And this monument was built by hand from scratch before metal was even invented in the New Stone Age 4,000 years ago. Avebury today is a spiritual mecca for all sorts of people. These call themselves Druids, the name the Romans gave to Iron Age priests, and they're celebrating Beltane, the passing of winter, and May Day. Like Jude Stammers, the attraction was irresistible. She actually moved house simply to be closer to the stones.
I moved here because I love this area, and all my life I've studied ancient wisdom and metaphysics, and it's just a wonderful place to learn from in that regard.
From previous excavations, we know that henges date to about 4,500 years ago, a period known by archaeologists as the Neolithic or New Stone Age. A henge is a Stone Age enclosure surrounded by bank and ditch. But what makes it different from defensive sites such as castles and hill forts is the fact that the ditch is inside the bank. That would hardly be ideal for defence, but it's perfect for defining a temple precinct. And what makes this henge at Avebury so special are the huge standing stones arranged in a circle just inside the ditch. This is sarsen. It's a hard sandstone rock that formed 20 to 30 million years ago. It was laid down as a layer over the chalk, which was then the seabed, but which now makes up the Wiltshire Downs. As the Earth's crust buckled and cracked over the following years, the sarsen layer broke up into a series of smaller blocks, which gradually accumulated in the valleys around. From there, the blocks were dragged a couple of miles to this spot where the monument was to be built. When we look at these stones, the first thing that really strikes me is quite how enormously heavy they are. The sheer effort involved in lifting them, let alone rolling them along the ground, even if it's only for a few hundred yards, must have been absolutely phenomenal.
Subjectively, if I come and spend time with like-minded people in a place that has a certain amount of magic for me, I come away feeling charged up and feeling good, so there's a tremendous value in just being there for that ceremony.
Silbury. I'm walking towards Silbury, the largest Neolithic mound in the whole of Europe. And I'm walking in a straight line down a Roman road which 2,000 years ago was directed straight at this enormous Neolithic mound. Because this Roman road is a military police road. And the mere fact that the Roman engineers considered it important to align their military road with Silbury shows that even 3,000 years after it was built, Silbury had an enormous power to be exerted on the people and the landscape around here. We can go all over Britain and we can investigate the Roman roads, and we can use the Roman paranoia to divine the Celtic, pre-Celtic sacred landscapes. Silbury. Standing at the Mother's Jam, sacred quarry at the heart of the Marlborough Downs. For thousands of years, humanity felt no need to build their own temples. Instead, they come to great sacred outpourings of the Mother Earth, huge waterfalls, significant yew trees, and then natural stone temples. And here at the Mother's Jam, I once picked 27 different types of mushrooms in under an hour. That's how fabulous this place is. But of course, as humanity changed, it was to these significant stones that they came when they needed material for their first temple. And so, it was 3 miles that they dragged stones from the Mother's Jam all the way over to the west to create the stone circle in Avery. But of course, nobody moves 38-ton stones without a considerable amount of thought. They would have examined each stone. They would have mused upon it with friends. They would have said, I think we should take this stone. I mean, I remember my great-grandfather having a great dream here. I remember him saying to my grandmother, that's a dreaming stone. I know what you're saying, but somehow the stone wouldn't look good in a circle. Would it look good upright? Yeah, but are we actually putting it up to look good, or are we putting it up because of significance? Well, I don't know. But the thing is, just on a practical level, how are we going to move it? And these conversations would carry on, where they would have to be pragmatic. They would have to make sense. We'll pick this stone because it looks good, it'll make sense standing upright, and it has significance. And bit by bit, the Temple of Avery was built. People were up here, polishing their stone axe heads, engaging in conversation, looking down on the same landscape that they've been visiting for thousands of years. And polishing stone would be used for everyday items, for polishing working axes. All the flint on these downs needed to be constantly resharpened for reuse. The Neolithic was especially a time of ceremonial objects. Rough versions of this ceremonial axe head would have arrived here, would be gradually worked, and then into the grooves, going down deep, endlessly back and forth. To this phenomenal, significant ritual object was created, something which the Neolithics managed to become absolutely obsessed with. In that way they were no different from us. In Europe, the biggest stone circle in the world, but Silbury is the centre of everything. The omphalos, the navel. 5,000 years ago, Silbury was white. entirely made of chalk. They kept it white to keep it prominent in the landscape. And yet, they built it on a valley floor. Because this is from a time when people didn't try to make these big, priapic, phallic monuments. They weren't trying to make it just purely impressive. To a certain extent, Silbury is hidden. And yet, when you travel around this huge landscape, you see it from everywhere. Silbury was the world hill, I think. Some people say it was the eye, the all-seeing eye, which you can see as you travel across the landscape, but can see you. The ancients would have been traveling for days. They would have collected at the sanctuary, we'd come down the West Kennett Avenue, and we finally burst into this huge, huge earth circle. And though Silbury is the center, Avebury is the place where they would have gathered. Thousands of people thronging this center. If we think of Mecca, and what Mecca means to Islam, then people travel for many days to Mecca. They make a perambulation, then they travel down into the Kaaba, and then they get right down into the center, and in the center is the Great Stone. This is very much the same thing. There's a quote in the Old Testament that says, "If thou makest me a temple, make it of unhewn stone, for if thou raise thy tool against it, thou hast polluted it." It seems to me that Avebury is an example of that period of natural temple.
megalithic prehistoric complex in Somerset. It consists of 3 stone circles, the largest of which is bigger than Stonehenge, and is the second biggest stone circle in Britain after Avebury. There is an outlier to the north called Holtville's Portage, which could have been part of a burial chamber. It's not visible from the Great Circle, but if put upright and other things between were removed, it would be. There is also a group of stones called the Cove near the church. The Webster site, map of the ancient landscape around Glastonbury by Paul Jenkins, has a diagram of the site showing an interesting alignment system. The centre of the Great Circle and that of the southwest one aligns with Haveville Point, and the centres of the Great and Northeast Circles align with the Cove. Also, the eastern edges of all 3 circles align with each other. All these alignments seem to be layers, spanning out for miles across the Somerset landscape, passing through some interesting places.
I'm 2 miles from where I'm working. I lose contact, and my equipment batteries are exhausted. A few days later, I learn they've managed to regroup. At Stony Cross, a disused airfield in the New Forest, they plan to stay for the solstice and recuperate. That it is not to be. While on my way to Hampshire on the 9th of June, I learn they've already been evicted, just before dawn, by 500 riot police. Their vehicles are all confiscated. By all accounts, they offer no resistance. Most continue their long pilgrimage to the solstice by walking for many days to Glastonbury Festival, where they are taken in. Along the way, they are showered with food and clothing by sympathetic residents.
We were on our way to Stonehenge. It was very much a group decision, like from the Rainbow Village people. Some of us had been to Stonehenge before and had quite a strong link there, and other people felt it was more of a political statement that even though we didn't care so much about Stonehenge, as a festival itself, we felt that it was an incredible infringement on our rights just to be told that we just can't go to this place, where people had been gathering for the last 11 years. And it was almost because we were told we shouldn't go there, we felt, it's a stand to make to actually go there, even though a lot of us felt quite a lot of trepidation about what would happen. And I think most of the people that were evicted from Molesworth in February ended up sort of going on the run to Stonehenge. And the police drove us into a field, actually forced us into a field, which was very well situated as far as, so that we were totally surrounded by the police on all sides. There was no possible avenue of escape. Then they brought in more troops and just came in and sort of smashed us all up. There was a few people managed to get away by some sort of chance.
And it was like a chance of 1 in 100, I say now. And it was very, very lucky. What made us get out? Well, basically, I think I was pregnant and she was very frightened. She was a bit too little, she didn't really know. She did notice it. And we just sort of, basically people running around they was just going mad, and the police was going mad, and everyone just looked like they'd totally lost everything sensitive. Everyone was just going, walking running around like chickens without heads on them.
Most of us offered absolutely no resistance, in terms of, violent resistance to the police or anything like that. And we all got arrested over the weekend. Our children were taken away from us, put into care over the weekend, which was very traumatic for the children, not to mention the parents. Our homes are broken up. A lot of us were living in buses or trucks, they were just smashed up. When we got released from prison, we were released with no homes to go back to because the police had impounded them all, and then they sort of drew out the process of actually releasing those vehicles for over a week, so that people were living. It was a very, very cold June, it's really, really cold. It was like pouring with rain. We're all sort of in this forest with maybe 20 people living in sort of buses which were normally housing 2 or 3. The vehicles coming out with windows smashed up, food strewn all over the floor, possessions broken and missing. And then ultimately 95% of us were never actually, we were all charged, but 95% of the charges were dropped without anybody ever going to court. So effectively what the police had done was they'd taken to deprive people of their liberty for a weekend, destroyed people's homes, and which is a deliberate process to try and break up travellers' ways of life and to try and grind people down to make them feel they couldn't actually go for something they believed in. If they didn't actually feel there was anything in the end to bring charges for, it just shows the whole sham of it being a kind of a legal operation. It was just an act of complete wanton vandalism.
vital to the National Trust of English Heritage, or whoever's sitting on them or behind them, to work out what can be done. Because something can be done. But I've also said, quite strongly, that we can't talk forever and get nowhere.
We go on being threatened in this way, we've got to defend ourselves.
The role of police has got to be the one of responding to the wishes of the landowners.
government created it, they won't recognise what they've created. They've created 3 million or 3.5 million unemployed. The people that live on the road, every year, given the chance, will get bigger and bigger and bigger because you can't exist within the city structure. So the kids come out on the road and they're trying to bash it.
Other minority groups you know in England, they get 24-hour police surveillance. And they want to harass us to go back to living squatting in the cities. That's one we're prepared to do.
A convoy of 150 trucks, coaches and caravans moved off shortly after midday to drive to Stonehenge in defiance of the law. They were 400, mostly men. On their 10-mile journey, they were observed from the air. Then the first roadblock. The holidaying public, now hopelessly caught up, turned round. The convoy came to a standstill at another block, then turned across